Hello everyone, and welcome to the Tome of Silver, the show where I randomly select a game from my collection, review it, and add it to an ever-growing ranking list. In the mid to late 90s, if you owned a Nintendo 64 instead of a PlayStation 1, your options for RPGs were very limited. The PS1 boasted titles like Final Fantasy, Tales, Suikoden, and Breath of Fire, just to name a few. The N64 had the excellent Paper Mario, and Ogre Battle 64, which was a solid strategy RPG, but that's about all that's worth mentioning. The N64 was a weak console for RPGs, so otherwise unremarkable RPGs gained recognition simply for being part of the genre, rather than for their quality. One example being Quest 64. Quest 64 was actually the first RPG released for the system, as well as the first entry in the very short-lived Quest series. Unfortunately, the game was rushed out the door, which is immediately apparent once you start playing. There were tons of content cut or not implemented into the final product, and while Quest 64 does have some admittedly interesting mechanics that prevent it from lacking any merit, we're still left with a very hollow game that fails to leave any sort of mark on the RPG genre. Put on your cape, summon some magic, and let's turn the page to Quest 64. For the Nintendo 64. We start our story in the medieval setting of Celtland, a fantasy world inspired by elements of Ireland. At the Monastery of Mages, the king has left in search of a thief who has stolen a magical tome known as the Elatail Book. In the wrong hands, this book has the potential to bring about the total destruction of the world. However, it's been some time since anyone has seen or heard word of the king's whereabouts. As such, the king's own son and apprentice mage takes it upon himself to find his father. This mage possesses powerful elemental abilities, and may be the only one with the strength to save the world. He is known the world over, and the very mention of him is enough to strike fear into the hearts of bandits everywhere. His name is Brian. And that's pretty much it. The plot is basic and shallow, with little development as you travel from town to town to defeat the bad guys, gather the elemental gems, and search for Brian's father. Brian is a silent protagonist, so don't expect him to learn or grow during the adventure either. This is one of those cases where the plot functions as an excuse for the gameplay, and wasn't something the developers put much thought or care into. There aren't even multiple party members either. There were originally other characters planned to join the player on their adventure, but they ended up among the many parts of the game that were scrapped. This is a purely solo adventure, consisting of Brian and Brian alone. With no real story to speak of, it puts a clear spotlight on the gameplay, which only makes it all the more obvious how lacking in depth Quest 64 is. Quest 64's gameplay is straightforward, asking the player to move from location to location while fighting random encounters on their way to the next boss. This is all you do, as Quest 64 lacks many core features of the genre. You cannot obtain better equipment to boost Brian's damage or defense. There are no party members to learn how to synergize as a team, no puzzles to solve in the various dungeons, nor any side quests or mini-games to earn extra money. Not that money would do you any good in this game, because there aren't any shops to buy consumable items either. Any item you obtain are either found in chests while exploring, or given by certain NPCs in town when you don't already have one in your inventory. Quest 64 is a very basic game, with the only aspect that makes it somewhat distinct being the combat system. Once a random encounter is triggered, you'll be locked into a circular arena, and the battle will enter a turn-based format, where you'll exchange turns between yourself and one of the enemies that have spawned. On your turn, you'll be able to move within a certain area, and either use an item, attack with your staff, or use an ability belonging to one of your 4 elements: water, air, fire, and earth. Each attack has a specific range and area of effect, meaning you'll need to position yourself correctly to land the spell. Additionally, if you're especially skilled, you can position yourself in such a way to hit multiple enemies at once. To To give credit where it's due, this is a rather innovative system that differs from the usual turn-based battles found in RPGs at the time, which more commonly use standard menus. The experience system is also quite atypical. Rather than leveling up and getting a boost to all of your stats at once, Quest 64 takes the Final Fantasy II approach with its XP system. There are no levels here. Instead, each individual stat is increased by using its corresponding ability. For example, attacking with your staff progressively raises your attack, while you'll improve your defense every time you're hit. After using enough spells, you'll be able to select which element you'd like to give a boost. You can evenly spread them out between all 4 elements, or focus on mastering a single element before switching to another, which provides plenty of player expression through the freedom to customize how they build Brian's magic. It's too bad this freedom is undermined by the poor balancing between the elements. Wind is far and away considered the weakest of the 4, while fire is middling. Meanwhile, earth deals the most damage with considerable range, and water does decent damage while also granting access to healing spells, an enormous advantage in a game with limited item pickups. Therefore, it's always best for players to invest first in water or earth, leaving fire for third and wind in dead last. There's no way to respec these either, so you can actually end up heavily screwing yourself over by following a different order. While the combat system is a good idea, it falls flat. The lack of party members takes away potential for strategy, and battles quickly become formulaic and repetitive. Boss fights are especially unengaging, essentially turning into an exchange of happy slaps until one of you drops. When you lose to a boss, it's rarely ever about coming back and retrying with a new plan. Though you lose any consumable items you used during the boss fight, you'll keep any of the experience you earned. So you'll likely end up making your way back to the boss, fighting random encounters to raise your defense and such, and try again while hoping your new stats are enough to overpower the boss. And if not, just do it again. You'll be strong enough eventually. That's really what the combat comes down to, brute forcing it until it inevitably works. The game is lacking too heavily in strategy or complexity to really do anything else. I also need to make special note of the camera. It's awful. When you're running through the environment, the camera moves wherever it wants, usually clipping through walls and other objects to show you areas of the game you're clearly not supposed to be seeing. Additionally, the way the camera rotates after a battle makes it extremely easy to get lost. Quest 64's environments are very bland, having few landmarks and are often either open fields or narrow caves, which makes it difficult to tell if you're going the right way or just running back the way you came. This is made worse by the absence of any kind of map you can consult. When you win a battle, the camera will rotate back in the direction you were facing when the battle began. However, if you chose to run away, the camera will instead turn to face the direction from which you left the battle. If you weren't paying close enough attention to the compass, it's easy to get disoriented and become completely lost in whatever area you're exploring, because the camera keeps rotating depending on how you finish a battle. There's not much to say about the game's visuals. Though there's a fully 3D world to explore, there's not much worth seeing, as the environmental design is bland and has very little going on. And I don't want to hear about how that should be expected for the N64. Quest 64 was released in June of 1998. A few months later in November, Ocarina of Time was released, with varied environments, a world that feels lived in, things to see and do around every corner, and uniquely fascinating characters. Okay, maybe it's unfair to compare Quest to one of the best games the system has to offer, but the point is the system was more than capable of intricate world design, of which Quest 64 has none. It's strictly open, barren fields with maybe a tree or two in the area if we're lucky, and there's simply no joy in getting to see Celtland. Because of its simplicity, I've seen Quest 64 compared to Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, claiming it's a basic, entry-level RPG that won't do much for experienced players, but can be a good introduction to the genre for beginners. I can't agree with this point. At face value, Quest 64 does seem to introduce the common expectations of RPGs. You level up your stats, travel to new cities and locations, and explore dungeons to reach a boss at the end. Although as basic as can be, this can provide a decently straightforward way to experience these elements without being overwhelmed by managing gold, upgrading equipment, and other such mechanics. But with how easy it is to get screwed over by upgrading the wrong elements, and how frustrating locations outside of towns can be to navigate, Quest 64 still doesn't make for a good RPG for beginners, and I would caution players against it. So in the end, you're left with an RPG that's neither recommended for newcomers to the genre, nor mechanically rich enough for more experienced players. Ultimately, this is an RPG for no one. If it weren't for the fact that it was the first and one of the few RPGs present on the N64, Quest wouldn't even be a footnote in the console's history. In 2000, Quest 64 would get a demake for the Game Boy Color, with greater emphasis placed on the story. It's the same events as the N64 version, but with more detail and a bit more development from some of the side characters. The combat was scaled down to fit the handheld system, with the same stat leveling, though the elements have been tweaked a bit, notably scaling down Earth's crazy damage. I was disappointed that they didn't implement the scrapped party members since they had this second chance, but instead you'll still be playing as a lone Brian. From what I understand, this game is an improvement over the N64 game, but not by much. It's mechanically superior, but still a simplistic game with very little going on under the hood. Hardly a must-play. The lack of 3D visuals may also be a turnoff for some, which could be a deciding factor for choosing to play the N64 version over this one. Quest 64 is an unimpressive, borderline unfinished game. The mechanically interesting combat system can only carry it so far, especially when said combat system isn't balanced well. When people were clamoring for an RPG on the N64, what they got instead was a bare-bones NES RPG with 3D graphics. Notable only because it's one of the few RPGs on the system. It has some interesting components, but it's so lacking in nearly every area that I just can't recommend this game to anyone, even as a novelty. It's boring at best and annoying at worst. There's not much fun to be scraped out of this. And that's all for this video. Definitely one of my shorter ones, but sadly there's just so little to dissect with Quest 64. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a like and maybe subscribing. It helps this channel a lot. As for today's question, what was the first RPG you can remember playing? Did you enjoy it, or was there something about it that made it difficult to engage with? I'd love to hear everyone's answers and experiences in the comments. Don't forget to wait until the end of the video to see which game or we will select next. In the meantime, thank you all so much for watching. Take care, and may we see each other again when we turn to the next chapter in the Tome of Silver.